Welcome to World Class Championship Wrestling with a special All London Zak Shaffer tribute to the legendary Bill Mercer as we thank the universe for that gift, that passion, that brilliance, that creativity, that great personality, and his favorite adjective, a tremendous drive. We celebrate his life and again share the great story of world-class championship wrestling and all the innovative characters and brilliance that went into it. Join us for this time together in Paul's absence, me and Zak, straight to you.
They say the third time is the charm to come back. Well, I don't even know what that expression even means. Third time is a charm. 3 is a lucky number. But you're back for the third time on Territory Marks. Mr. Marc Lowrance, welcome back to the show. Sans Paul London.
Thank you for having me. And you know, when you talk about psychology and healthy behaviors versus dysfunctional behaviors, without Paul here, I don't have the behavior triangle. And I can't go at you through him or vice versa. So I guess I'll have to behave myself.
Well, you know, if you don't, and I'll just blame it on Paul not being here. So
blame him by default.
Yeah. No, this is really a big deal. You know, for those that don't know, you've been on the show 3 times now. This is a very special occasion for you to come back because sadly, a little over a month ago, a friend of yours, friend of the show, Bill Mercer passed away at the age of 99. And you and I had spoken soon after it happened. And I said that I wanted to do a tribute to Mr. Mercer. And you said, well, I would love to do that too. If I'm in the area, let's make it happen. And here we are making it happen. So thanks for being on the show and being able to talk about the man that who's left an indelible mark on just life in general. Would you say he did?
I think so. And what delighted me after we learned of his passing was the younger broadcasters that he had helped teach, train, and mentor through his career at the University of North Texas, who just revered him as such a wonderful guy who helped them so much.
Yeah.
And I was glad for that because so much of his career, the prime, you know, has been done 30 and 40 and 50 years ago now.
Right.
So for that new generation, that was really neat. I don't think they ever had a life celebration, funeral, memorial service, anything like that, unless the family did something privately.
Yeah. So a little bit of inside backstory. I've shared it before. His granddaughter, Rachel, was the one that put us in touch, Bill and I. And then when you and I communicated about it, and you were able to come down and actually help facilitate the conversation, the interview that Paul and I did with Bill, you had said that, you know, depending on the circumstances when Bill passed away, you would kind of give a eulogy at his funeral. And you said that he was not necessarily a man of God. He was more of a man of science, would you say?
Yes, he was a man of spirit. It wasn't God that was the impediment. It was religion. And he found the practice of religion to be inconsistent, filled with hypocrisy, filled with things that did not interest Bill. But when you talk to him on a spiritual level, you could find that trust in a advocating and loving mystery. And in that last deal, when the interview was over, I talked to him a little bit about that and just said, if you want someone who understands you, Bill, in not only a professional way, but in a spiritual way, I'll be glad to help, you know, have a part in any life celebration. And he thanked me and he liked the idea. And he said, I will tell my granddaughter about that. So I don't know if he ever did, if he remembered.
Yeah.
And it's no big deal that it didn't happen. I respect their privacy.
Of course, yeah.
But Bill was a sharp guy, which we've talked about and we'll talk about today. But He had a spiritual side. He just didn't play the game of religion.
Yeah, he struck me as the kind of person, in the limited time I knew him, in the research that I did about Bill, he struck me as the kind of guy who had a deeper interest in things than maybe other people might not. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think that's part of his reluctance toward religion. He found it rather shallow. And oftentimes an attempt to control some deity or control and manipulate people.
Right.
And he just wasn't into that, but he definitely had a curiosity. And I don't remember what time we were together, but I mentioned the 14th chapter of the book of John in the Judeo-Christian Bible. Of course, that's Christian scripture there, where Jesus is speaking, and he's got his pal there, Thomas. And it's, in my Father's house are many rooms, many mansions. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go and prepare a place for you? And when I go and prepare that place for you, I will come again and take you to it. That's when Thomas stopped him and said, don't know where you're to go. How can we know the way? And that's where religion has jumped in and turned that into something very conditional, very exclusive, very judgmental. Are you a believer? And what church do you go to? And my God's better than your God. My Bible's better than your Bible. And my church better than your church. And that's just all BS.
Right.
Jesus said that simply to say, trust me. The details are not for you to know. And that's how he answered Thomas. And when he finishes that, he underscores that invitation just to trust the unknown when he says, my peace I give to you. My peace I leave with you. Not as the world gives do I give. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. And that just simple trusting what we're not wired to understand as humans is what Bill could relate to, as opposed to all of you got to do this and you got to do that. And do you believe? And do you know? So
right.
That's why I defined him as a spiritual person and not a religious person.
Yeah. I mean, look, I tend to lean more towards that direction as well, but I gotta think that living to the age of 99 and passing away quietly, you know, and he's somewhere in the universe, probably having a good laugh, either going, I was wrong all along, or I was right all along. I knew it, you know, or he's, you know, reincarnated as a baby that was just born the other day. Who knows? But I really appreciate your perspective on these things, because being a man of faith, being a man that has worn many hats as well, like Bill, you come to the table with not just your relationship with Bill, but just a greater sense of like, what's this world all about? And you just have it. I appreciate your perspective is what I'm saying. What are your memories of Bill? Like, what are some things that stand out to you when you think of Bill Mercer, the name Bill Mercer? Well,
I was fascinated by Bill's history because I have ancestry from the state of Oklahoma, even though I'm a Texas boy. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But my dad got laid off when I was still in a car seat and have been in Fort Worth ever since. But all of his family and my mother's family were from Oklahoma. And Bill was a native of Muskogee, Oklahoma. I'm just an Okie from Muskogee. Remember that
I do
song?
know that song. Yeah.
Picked up education. You know, he served the country in 43, I think, through 46 in the Navy.
Oh, okay.
And was in Okinawa and Aleutian Islands, a lot of different locations, participated in numerous invasions.
Wow.
So he was very successful and had great respect for our nation. And then he got his education in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, a little state college there, then on to Denver, and then came back and got his master's degree, I think, from what we know now is University of North Texas, which then was North Texas State.
Okay.
And that's probably where his relationship began, because later in life, you know, he came back and went on staff there. Right. So I appreciated that. Appreciated Bill's history. There was an American Football League team in Dallas in the early 60s that was owned by Lamar Hunt.
Okay.
That got sold and moved to Kansas City and became the Kansas City Chiefs, which then wound up being in the NFL when they merged. I think,
wow.
and I could be wrong, I think Bill did some radio for that AFL Dallas Texan franchise.
Really? Okay.
And then when the Cowboys started playing at the Cotton Bowl, Bill was the number 2 guy behind Jay Randolph, that some of our older audience members will remember as a big name on NBC Sports, who then retired and has been gone a long time. And when he left the Cowboys, Bill took over and was their guy. And I don't know what happened or what changed in there, but Bill wound up, as we talked in our first installment, doing minor league baseball.
Right.
For the Dallas, I think they were called the Rangers because Fort Worth had the Cats.
Okay.
And then when the cities got together and quit arguing over the airport and all of the petty stuff that was almost like a wrestling gimmick, Fort Worth versus Dallas for years.
Yeah.
They dreamed of Major League Baseball. And so that's when they built what was the shell of what many of our fans will remember is Arlington Stadium. It was Turnpike Stadium.
Okay.
Pretty much a first base to third base double-tiered beginning that seated about 14,000 people. A lot of it was bench seats then. And the Cats finished up, the Dallas team finished up, and the Double-A Dallas-Fort Worth Spurs began as what was a part of that dream of getting the cities together for Major League. And Bill was their broadcaster.
Okay, wow.
And he did that for probably 5 or 6 years, until Bob Short entered agreement with the city of Arlington and brought the Senators to Texas for the 72 season. And Bill, of course, was grandfathered in. And in our first installment, I made a mistake. I said the city of Arlington owned the team, and that's not true. Bob Short owned the team, then later sold it to Brad Corbett. But they owned the broadcast rights. That was part of the agreement for some reason. So the city of Arlington had the broadcast rights. And they weren't paying Bill a competitive major league salary. So after 2 seasons, the first with Don Drysdale as his number 2 guy, and then the second year with Dick Reisenhoover, who was a very popular sports anchor in the Fort Worth, Dallas area, Bill got frustrated and gave up on the Rangers and took the job in Chicago, which I described in the first installment with Harry Kerry.
Right.
I think in hindsight, and we've all made mistakes, that was a critical career mistake for Bill.
Yeah.
That he never was able to recover from in terms of doing baseball. Because Dick Reisenhoover took the Rangers job and was just immensely popular. Had a good-looking son in high school playing at one of the Arlington high schools. People just went ape over Dick Reisenhoover, and they forgot about Bill. And Bill was doing great work with the White Sox until he got into that ego deal with Harry Carey.
Right.
And which I won't go into again because we covered that.
Yeah.
But when Bill got the axe there, that was 2 major league jobs he had lost. And broadcasting is very competitive. It can also, I hate to use the word, let's just say it can be mean. And it can be cutthroat.
Okay.
And because Bill was out, and he later talked to me about this privately, he said, Major League Baseball is great, but once you fall out of it, it's next to impossible to get back in. And I think Bill aggressively tried to get back in, but he couldn't. And he had burned the bridge with the Rangers because they had told him to stay. Just stay with us, Bill. It's going to come, which it did. But by then it was too late.
Well, he was offered, he had the opportunity to go to a big location like Chicago, and that is one of those carrots that's dangled in front of you. You got to take it, I guess.
Yes, and I could see why he thought that. The White Sox then were a big number 2 to the Cubs.
Right.
the shadow of Harry Carey was so dark that it was going to be hard for anybody.
Of course. I mean, it's legendary.
Unless you just had, no ego at all.
Right.
And Bill approached it as a journalistic broadcaster who researched and had the stats and did a professional job. And while Harry did some of that, he disguised it with, I got old boys, here, Zak Shaffer, and
that gimmick. He had
that was his
iconic gimmick.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Pearsall wound up following Bill a couple of years later, and the South Side fans loved Jimmy because he and Harry were drinking buddies.
Bill didn't have a gimmick. That was his thing. He didn't have a gimmick. He wasn't like a character. He was very much like you said. He did the research. He did the statistics. He was a by the numbers kind of guy, which I think appeals to a lot of people, but maybe it doesn't appeal to a mass audience.
Well, all this is leading up to one of my great feelings of adoration and respect for Bill, because when you think about these years,
yeah,
Rangers 72-73, White Sox 73-74. Interesting, he was in a bad Amtrak train derailment after he got fired, which I'll only tell if you ask about it.
I mean,
but you go back into those
there.
years, Bill is getting close to 50 years old.
Yeah. We're talking, 1970?
75, when he lost the Sox deal.
Yeah.
So Bill is entering into midlife crisis years. When his youth is behind him, he's lost these 2 Major League Baseball jobs, and he comes back home. And I don't know if he contacted Fritz or if Fritz contacted him, because as a young broadcaster, Fritz had done some radio wrestling and some TV studio wrestling with KRLD. And that's where he had first connected with Fritz as a young wrestler.
You sent me a video clip that I think we'll play a little snippet of where Bill is interviewing Fritz. I believe it's in the 60s.
We're back here at the Sportatorium, and I'd like you to meet, of course, the gentleman you know, well known for his cigar, but also greatly known for his tremendous wrestling ability, Fritz von Erich.
You had to work that bit in about the cigar, didn't you, Mercer? You always do.
Well, I think you look distinguished with the cigar. I think
you notice nothing but the best.
The beauty.
Where Fritz is very much in his gimmick of being a heel. It's
Look
fantastic.
like David.
Very much so.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Well, anyway, so Bill comes back, and when Bill was a young broadcaster and had done some wrestling, that was just part of, getting started.
Right.
But when he came back and took the then only show, Saturday Night Wrestling on Channel 11, that cutthroat world of broadcasting regarded him as a has-been, as a failure.
Right.
Major League Baseball, Dallas Cowboys, now he's doing wrestling, it's over. And by that time, anybody who's going to do wrestling is going to get typecast, and it's going to limit your opportunities. When I was a young broadcaster, I tried several things, and if they'd even respond to you at all, it was a very patronizing, almost laugh-in-your-face deal, because wrestling was regarded in the broadcast world like the circus.
Yeah.
It's a show. Well, Bill did the wrestling and did it well, and went on as the sports anchor for KVIL Radio, which I mentioned in one of our times, as their sports guy. And Ron Chapman was the biggest morning drive disc jockey in the Southwest in those years. And he and Bill had a good on-air rapport. And then he got on with the North Texas State doing their football and basketball, and then later on their faculty as an instructor. And he didn't have a doctorate. He had his master's degree.
Okay.
But I'm telling you all that because he worked hard to put a career back together from shambles.
That's inspirational in itself.
It really is. I mean,
50-year-old man. I mean,
and
now, that time,
and now moving into his 60s.
Right.
And so for him to put that back together brought great respect and credibility to anybody who knew the story.
Right.
For those who didn't, it was still Bill and as a has-been, but that wrestling typecast was really tough. I remember I was in the sports information office of Daniel Meyer Coliseum one night at halftime of a TCU basketball game. I was the PA guy for football and basketball in those years, and a writer from the Star-Telegram had been a little rude a time or two, but that night he jumped me because he had a gallery around him and he felt safe. And it was the fraud of pro wrestling and taking a shot at me because they could not stand the ratings we were getting. They could not stand the crowds filling Reunion Arena, 35,000 at Texas Stadium, selling out the Fort Worth Convention Center, turning people away. They just couldn't grasp this because wrestling was such a farce to them.
Yeah.
And that's the night in front of that audience. I thought I might get fired from TCU.
Wow.
I never raised my voice. I never used bad language, but I put that writer in his place. And I talked about some things that he didn't want to hear, and he never said a word, and he never spoke to me for the rest of his career whenever we would come in contact.
Wow.
But it was a tough world to dig out of that wrestling typecast, and Bill did it so well, so I have great respect for him.
Yeah, I mean, to know that you're starting the second stage of your life and having to not reinvent, but start a new career essentially, in the world of professional wrestling. It's doing that in 2025 is a hard thing to do, but back in the 70s, even that much harder. So that's impressive. Before we get into that though, you briefly dropped the Amtrak train derailment. You want to talk a little bit about that? That's interesting.
And I don't have the exact dates. Bill and I talked about it once, but it's been years ago. I think it was after he had lost his job in Chicago.
Okay.
I think it was October of 75. And I get the feeling that Bill and his wife had shipped most of his belongings back to Dallas. And Bill loved the train. It's another thing we had in common. I love to travel by train.
Absolutely.
They got on the Amtrak Lone Star, Chicago, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Fort Worth, Houston to come home.
Yeah.
They had a bedroom in the sleeping car. And out north of Ardmore, Oklahoma, going by a refinery, it's a 50-mile-an-hour curve out there, even to this day. The rail turned over under the train.
Oh, my gosh.
And the train derailed, and the cars turned over. It threw Bill and his wife around a little bit, but they were fine in their compartment. But a lot of people got hurt, mainly employees, because it was about 10:30 in the morning. It was between breakfast and lunch. But the dining car staff took the biggest hit because in those days you had big, old, heavy steel chairs in the dining car around the tables, so they'd stay put as the train moved.
Right.
But when the car turned over, those heavy chairs fell across the car.
Oh, God.
And the waiters often in those days would sit there and polish silver and stuff between meals because they still had real service in the table calls in those days.
Right.
They're the ones that got hurt. It was that wreck, this is rail trivia, that motivated the National Transportation Safety Board to require anchored down permanent seating in all American rail cars, and that's been the case ever since.
Wow.
When you ride a train now and go into the dining car, it's booth seating.
Yeah.
And the booths are anchored to the floor. Nothing's going to fall if it turns over. Even in the compartments, if there's a little chair and adjacent to a sofa, it's got to be anchored. And that was the wreck that motivated that. And Bill never really did want to talk about it. He just bragged on how nice everybody was to him and how well Amtrak handled it, which is a little glimpse of the positive attitude that Bill always had that carried him through, allowed him to put his career back together, and allowed him to dream with Mickey Grant that he had met at KVIL, who had that dream of this well-produced wrestling telecast that they sold the concept to Fritz and Channel 39 that became world-class. And, of course, Bill was in on that as the host of it, and Mickey was the producer. And when we go back, and we were talking about that cage door match at Reunion Arena in 82.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff that led up to that. When you see the slow motion replay of Kerry Von Erich body slamming King Kong Bundy.
Right.
And the Freebirds and the Von Erichs bludgeoning each other, and the perspiration and the hair flying up close in slow motion. You have a hard time convincing somebody that that's a work. It was so well produced, and Bill's positive attitude was such an important part of that happening.
From the Will Rogers Complex in Fort Worth, here's Saturday Night Wrestling. 90 minutes of excitement with the world's greatest professional wrestlers.
In the brief amount of time that I spent talking to him over the phone, the moment I mentioned that Territory Marks was a wrestling podcast, he lit up. His energy about talking about wrestling was so colorful. Like, he loved to talk about wrestling. He was so excited about it. I remember in our interview that we did, bringing up certain vignettes, he just lit up. And so I want to touch base on that and talk about that, his time with World Class, because he clearly loved what he did, and it came across, and when I say that he didn't have that Harry Carey gimmick, in a way he did have a gimmick. He was that reliable source that you could always count on when you saw him on screen, and knowing behind the scenes, he's instrumental in helping all of this happen. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like him getting involved with Mickey Grant and moving forward and yada, yada, yada.
Well, think about it, Zach. There is I would call it a gift from the mystery quality of vindication for Bill, because Major League Baseball has this persona of being top of the game, top of your career to land with any team. And then all of a sudden he's doing Saturday Night Wrestling on Channel 11. Well, like we said, it's pretty well over for old Bill.
Right.
But when that show took off and that production was so incredible, and the talent, and it wasn't just the wrestlers, it wasn't just the production, it wasn't the announcer, it wasn't just the sportatorium, it was the melding and the team effort of all of it. But all of a sudden that show is not only going all over the country and locally helping sell out arenas like I've already described, it went around the world.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden Bill has fame beyond what he ever would have had he stayed in baseball. Because you have your market areas, or maybe you could connect like John Miller did and do ESPN stuff, the game of the week.
Right.
But Bill became much more of a celebrity. And so that's part of the reason why he was so excited when you brought the subject up, because that was that new horizon that Bill never thought he would have when he was clawing to put that career back together. And all of a sudden, he's the third most popular man in all of Israel in terms of the ratings, behind, Kerry and Kevin Von Erich.
Right.
So it had to bring him great delight and great joy. And Bill talked about that patronizing view from the media, and how he then had the permission to fire back and say, well, whatever you think, I wish you had the crowds that we had. I wish you had the ratings that we had. I wish you had the syndication revenues that we have.
Right.
And it would just stun the critics. And that was so vindicating for Bill. And I'm so thankful he had that experience.
Me too. It reminds me of when people say scoreboard. Just look at the scoreboard. Who won?
Exactly.
We had covered in the previous episode of Territory Marks, we covered the 1982 cage match between Ric Flair and Kerry Von Erich. And I sent you the, it's titled on YouTube, and there's a link in our show notes, the story of Ric Flair and Kerry Von Erich that year. And it stood out to me because it was a complete compilation of all the moments that led up to the cage match. It's a really beautifully edited piece on YouTube. And there were so many questions because there were so many iconic moments in that. Specifically, like you said, Kerry Von Erich body slamming King Kong Bundy, who up until that point, the Hogan-Andre match hadn't happened yet. So this, iconic moment in sports history had already been done, but a selective audience had seen it. Bill is in almost all these vignettes, doing the commentary, running the interviews. You are as well as announcing the matches, which is fantastic. But Bill is interviewing Ric Flair many times, and there is a few moments where Ric Flair is getting in Bill's face and saying, "I know you're close with the family. You go tell Fritz, blah 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 blah." And then he walks away, and Bill's got a smile on his face, like he's about to laugh his ass off, basically. How much behind the scenes was Bill involved with that, or any of that, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, here's your 3 hour and 45-minute answer to your question. When Bill did the Fort Worth show on Channel 11, before World Class ever started syndication, which I outlined in our second installment,
yeah,
Bill was an employee of Fritz and Southwest Sports. And I assume he was getting about $100 a show, because when Bill pulled out to take over the new syndicated show, which was burgeoning from the beginning, and they gave me Channel 11, that's what I was getting, $100.
Okay.
Of course, it went up over the years,
As
but
it should.
in those days, it was still, for a young guy, $100 a good night's work.
Right.
Well, when that happened, Bill ceased to be an employee of Southwest Sports. He was an employee of Channel 39 and the production of the World Class show. So he was paid a salary. It was a good career move financially for him,
right?
Whatever that was, to do those World Class shows. Bill was never in the so-called booking meetings, to my knowledge, but he would be familiarized as they would get ready, because if you remember me explaining that, they moved Dallas from Sunday night to Friday when the World Class show started, and they would tape every other Friday. They would tape 2 one-hour World Class Championship Wrestling segments, and then the next week we just had a house show. And there would be time during the day on Friday that Bill would be versed. But what you've got is you've got this incredible production, and you've got this incredible talent.
Yeah.
With these burgeoning Von Erich boys. You've got the Freebirds on the scene, but you've got this remarkable, inspiring, creative choreography and brilliance behind the scenes from Fritz, who had a mind for it. Gary Hart, who gave his life to the business, was an encyclopedia. No one was ever in deeper than Gary.
Right.
You had David Manning, who was young and fresh, who had caught on to the business, came out of Irving MacArthur High School. Fritz was fond of him. He was brought in. He had great ideas. You had Bronco Lubitsch, was the old steady who could help temper and stuff and contribute. And occasionally they would bring in a Michael Hayes or somebody to offer creative input. But when you think about what they went into that, because it's not just Kerry versus Flair.
Yeah.
You've got Gary Hart and Armand Hussein.
Yes.
And Hussein one night, spur of the moment on an interview, just dreamed up Hussein and Hart Limited, the association.
H&H.
And Gary got upset with him and said, if we're going to do this, it's going to be Hart and Hussein, not Hussein and Hart.
I mean, let's know the protocol here.
Which is what happened. But Bronco Lubitsch used to tell the story of when they would drive to Lawton, Oklahoma, and he sometimes traveled with Hussein. They passed a big mansion outside of Decatur that had a little servants' quarters off to the side. And Hussein would say, Bronco, you need to buy that house. You can live out here with Ellen, be so happy, and I'll just take that little place in the back. And Bronco said, no, Armand, I would never do that, because in 6 months I'd be out in the back and you'd have that house. Hussein just had that manipulative salesman quality about him, a comedic genius, brilliant, wonderful guy. Had he had an agent, he could have come to Hollywood. But anyway, you have Hart and Hussein. By the way, if you ever look at Hussein on the interviews, you can just tell by the expression on his face, he's full of crap. Just instinctively, you can't beat it out of him. So I just loved him so much. But you've got them together who are also after the Von Erichs. And then you have Flair, who has allegedly hired Gary Hart and Hussein and paid them a bounty to do irreparable damage to Kerry Von Erich's knee.
Right.
And that's a way that Flair can avoid, ever having to defend the belt. What's so odd about that is orthoscopic surgery was new in the early 80s. It was very innovative. And so guys that used to have their knee cut open for major rebuilding and be out could have orthoscopic work then and be out for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
At some point in the midst of all this, Kerry really did have to have some surgery. And, they just scripted all this in, to make it this big deal. And then supposedly Fritz somehow finds evidence of this $12,500 check.
Via King Kong Bundy.
Via King Kong Bundy.
Right.
And when they ask Hart and Hussein about it, no, they ask Flair about it.
Yeah.
They ask all of them about it.
Yeah, they do.
The alibi is that Flair wanted a new Cadillac station wagon. How many Cadillac station wagons did you ever see? Oldsmobile and Buick had them, and Cadillac experimented, but only in Texas can you get one. So they were going to do the deal, and Gary would pay the Cadillac dealer $10,000 and keep $2,500 for himself. The imagination in all of this is
brilliant.
Just incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you've got this whole chemistry of stuff, and Kerry is overcoming these insurmountable odds. And Big Daddy Bundy, who is how Kong started out with the Von Erichs, has sold out to Gary,
right.
And he's in all of this. And then he's tempted to swing back the other way if the price is right. You've got Kabuki and the Green Mist trying to do the dirty work on the knee.
Right.
You've got Hussein involved. You've got guys in masks. The Magic Dragon, don't know who in the world they are.
Right.
Everybody's after Kerry. And it was so brilliantly done.
It really is.
And as great as that cage door slamming match was, it was the lead up to it that was so absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
And the greatest years of world class, 82, 83, 84, 85, were all built on that angle and that TV production.
Outstanding that it's a level of storytelling that I don't think people necessarily recognize, like the brilliance involved. Everything you just described, like I'm listening to you going, yeah, the whole time. I think for non-wrestling fans, and we do have a select audience of our show that doesn't watch wrestling or maybe doesn't have the depth of knowledge that we do, or our casual wrestling fans. It is remarkable, and it's all documented out there. And to know that, all the components that lead up to this big match. And Paul and I had said that the match itself, while the ending was a little left to be desired, I think, in the result and the way it ended, everything that I think it's more important, everything that led up to that point, and the way the Freebirds were introduced. And that started a whole epic feud that, like you said, would continue many years into the future. It is brilliant. And I encourage everybody to go back and watch those matches, those vignettes, those promos. Fritz and Flair going at it on a promo is remarkable. And the intensity that Fritz has to defend his son. I think it's just fact that Kerry was not strong on the mic, so he had all these other things to kind of lead him into that. One thing being, he does a sit-down interview with Bill Mercer, and Bill is so great with guiding the questions, right? And the loathing that Gary Hart has for Bill Mercer as well when they have their interviews too. Behind the scenes, the relationship between Gary Hart and Bill Mercer, I'm assuming, was a positive one. Was it not?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, when it all fell apart in the later 80s, Bill did some work for Ken Mantell with Wild West Wrestling, which got merged back in with World Class when Ken came back. And then after that, Gary started a promotion called Gary Hart's something or other Texas Wrestling, and Bill did some TV for them.
Okay.
He and Gary were very close. And I'm glad you mentioned that with Gary and his discord with Bill.
It's brilliant.
Because Gary was such an artist at what he did.
Right.
He always left you with that reasonable doubt that Gary had been given the shaft. He never got his fair shake.
Yeah.
And a good heel just knows how to do that. And he did it so well. And then you also mentioned the Freebirds. And for those in the audience who don't know, they were brought in by Gary, who was the booker.
Okay.
And were baby faces.
Yeah. In storyline, David brought them in, right? And they won the 6-man with David. And then David relinquished his belt to Buddy Rogers, who was allegedly in Denver at the time.
Yeah. Well, we talked once about how hard it was for Fritz to be the babyface because of his natural heelish personality, how aggressive he was.
Right.
That's true of Michael Hayes as well. Even though he was a babyface, he was so flamboyant and so aggressive. And that's why that Cage Door storyline was so good, because Hayes just got tired of the honest, wholesome, goody two-shoes Von Erich routine. You know, here's your chance. Go for it. Take it, for God's sake.
Right.
And when he doesn't, he loses his composure. And, of course, we know what happens.
Yeah.
And then that heel and that feud, you know, just set the wrestling world on fire.
That night, you are the announcer for the match and giving critical calls at the end as well. You're calling for a doctor to come down and, you know, assist with Kerry. I'm assuming that was at Reunion Arena. I believe there's 20,000 people there that night. Can you describe, to the best of your knowledge, you said it was a little cloudy, but do you remember anything about that night, that event?
Well, one thing I want to interject, and I'm not avoiding your question, I'm going to get to it.
Yeah, please.
Is part of what we're talking about and the storylines and the stories that I see wrestling fans of my generation, older and even a little younger, starve for today, is what we talked about in that first installment, the one-man commentator.
Yeah.
Because that gave that commentator the chance to tell the story, to relive it, to remind people of the chapters,
Right.
and incorporate that into what's happening right now. That with the color guy, you can't do unless the color guy is specifically scripted into that.
Yeah.
And then you'd almost have to work out who's going to do what. And I'm not bashing color guys in wrestling.
No.
They bring another dimension and have some great qualities. If I were doing it again, I'd want to have some of both. There would be some matches where it's me and Zak, me and Paul, me and whomever, and then some others where you just have your Bill or your Marc, just for the purpose of the storytelling. Now, rephrase your question again to make sure I get it right.
The night of Star Wars, December of '82, you were instrumental as far as introducing the match and the opponents and whatnot, but also calling down for the doctor. Can you describe any recollections you had from that evening?
Well, first of
that
all,
are in this, again, you can say whatever you want because, you know, we're PG.
Talking about Bill having vindication. When I go on TV with Saturday Night Wrestling, which is the local telecast every Saturday night, I'm getting a lot of positive attention, but I'm picking up some of that condescending criticism, you know, this is a phony deal.
Right.
But at Thanksgiving of 1982, the promotion sold out Reunion Arena with seats on the floor, more than 20,000 people. And I walk into the building that afternoon, seeing children crying as their parents lead them away from the building because they can't get tickets.
Oh, wow.
And everybody's laughing. Wrestling on Thanksgiving? Wrestling on Christmas? You got to be nuts. Well, it was brilliant. I mean, the famdamly's on your nerves by about 4 o'clock on Christmas and Thanksgiving. They're looking for something to do. The movie theaters are full on those nights.
Right.
It was the perfect night. So now we're at Christmas. They'd come off the big Thanksgiving show, and the energy and the electricity was just so thick that anyone would be excited. And so I'm versed with Bill and the bookers as to what we're going to need to do, it's Bill's show. It's the world-class show, so I'm the ring announcer.
Right.
But I've got certain cues to do and certain things, like you said, to call over the house mic, the big impromptu excitement and all this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
And it was just incredibly exciting. And the fact that cage door was on the back of the ring and it comes toward the camera.
Right.
And Kerry is there and you see him sell it so brilliantly and he just pops back and falls. And Flair then goes on and it's just bludgeoning him from where the bolt, the screw that's in the hinge of that handle had hit him. It was just so incredible. And to be there and to feel the excitement. I'm not sure in our culture today, with the violence that we see, the drug addiction, the gun abuse and firearm, that we could do it anymore safely. But the crowd, I mean, it was just unlike anything I've ever experienced. And, I've done football games.
Yeah.
In the TCU press box, 16 stories above the playing field with 50,000 people there. And it's exciting, dramatic, comeback, like football can be, but nothing ever touched that wrestling stuff.
No, I can't imagine. I can't imagine. That sound still rings in my ear, that sound of that cage door smashing. And you're right there to witness the whole thing. It's outstanding.
Yeah. And I don't know what Gordy did or what they prepared.
Yeah.
But to make sure it did make that clang, that was just so perfect.
It is. Yeah, I will probably play a little bit of that as well, just to refresh everyone's memories. How much of Bill and you is involved with improv as far as what Bill was, going into an interview or something like that? He has these great interviews, again, with Gary Hart, with Ric Flair, with Fritz, with Kevin, with Kerry, sorry. And I'm wondering, was there a level of improv in those interviews?
There was an objective to each interview. And when I did the Fort Worth show, for example, I would sit down with the booker and often his assistant, which a lot of times is David Manning and or Bronco.
Right.
And we would go through the matches and everything they wanted me to get across about the match itself and about the big picture. And then we would stop. I'd go to the back, and I'm saying this because Bill would do the same thing in Dallas, and you'd get your marching orders for the interview. But when you had great minds like Gary Hart, like Ric Flair, like Michael Hayes, you could almost ask questions impromptu and they would be right on it like flies on a picnic because they just had that ability. With Kerry and Kevin and some of the others, you'd have to guide and bait a little bit.
Yeah.
But with those great heels that had those great minds, you did have that improvisational ability to let the thing go kind of where it went as long as you achieved your main objective.
Was there a face that could do that? Because you're mentioning all the heels were really sharp on their feet. But was there a baby face, legit baby face, not someone who was a tweener or anything like that, that you felt was really good with that level of improv?
Yes, and that would be Bruiser Brody.
From Albuquerque, New Mexico, 306 pounds, Bruiser Brody.
306 pounds of bruising dynamite. Bruiser Brody.
Who was most of the time a baby face when he was with us.
Yeah.
He was very good at it. Chris Adams was a baby face for a while until he and Gino tagged up, and Chris could do it. But remember, when you have the Von Erichs, most of our great talent is going to be the heels because the Von Erichs are the fixture there.
Right.
So I never got to have as much experience as some of the other guys in other offices would have with bright, smart baby faces.
Bruiser's one of those guys that Just there will never be another one like that. He was just so iconic, and to be a babyface and have that look was pretty remarkable as well.
Yeah, and of course he wasn't a babyface everywhere he went. He
No,
was
no.
with us.
Yeah, true.
And he was
AWA, of course,
he was the booker for a while.
Yeah.
In those challenging years, and did pretty well with it. He didn't like it, but he had a great mind for the business.
Was he forced to be the booker?
Well, I lose track of the order of things because Gary Hart was the booker when I got hired.
Yeah.
And I think it was that 82 Christmas Star Wars Cage Door night when Gary got so upset with his payoff.
Really?
It was $3,500. And Gary thought that was a demeaning insult. And he confronted Fritz about it. And Fritz's response was, and I can't articulate everything I've heard, but basically, you're too big for your britches.
Wow.
There are two stories.
Wow.
Bill always said that Fritz fired him. Gary always said he quit. Whatever it was a horrific tragedy of two incredible minds that we needed together. I also know that Ken Mantell had been, to use biblical language again, proselyting for that position and painting Gary to Fritz as old school, slow motion, not enough energy, and understated. And Gary was tremendous at being understated. That was part of his strength.
Yeah.
And Gary was hearing that
It's
and
lacking.
was doing the things he needed to do to pick up energy. But Gary Hart is not Jim Cornette. They're different personalities. But whatever it was, Gary and Fritz parted ways. Gary had been so close to that family. It was Uncle Gary to the boys.
Right.
That Gary left, but he didn't go far. And by the time we went to Texas Stadium in the spring of '84, Gary was making some appearances with us again and was big in that show.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Ken Mantell takes over as the booker after Gary either gets fired or quits and has the pinnacle years.
Right.
And did the stuff with Sunshine and the female valets and helped ramrod the great feud between the Von Erichs and the Freebirds. And is in on the Chris Adams, Gino Hernandez stuff. But Ken was not known as being a good finish booker. And David Manning did most of the finishes based on the objective of that particular match in the storyline. And then Ken got upset. This is going back to the bruiser question, the ordering of the bookers. Ken got upset when WWE was taking talent, and Fritz would not run against those old territorial promoters. Because by now the ratings are not just skyrocketing locally. You're being seen in everybody else's market.
Right.
It's the first time that's ever happened. You're in Israel and going overseas. Fritz, if you don't take this nationwide and worldwide and take advantage of this, somebody else is going to. And Fritz steadfastly refused. That's when Fritz and Bill Watts fell in love with each other, so to speak. And he left and went to Watts's promotion in Oklahoma and Louisiana and Arkansas. And I think they changed the name of it to the UWF.
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
And Watts had been down on his luck in previous years and had gone to Jerry Jarrett and asked for help. And Jarrett had done that talent exchange with the Tennessee promotion.
Over in Memphis, yeah.
Yeah, and then Ken came in and ran with that, and then Ken wound up taking a lot of the world-class talent.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if David then followed. I think David followed Ken Mantell. And then
David Manning.
David Manning. Or it may have been George Scott, who came from WWF, which is what WWE was then.
Right.
David could tell us if we would call him. But it was either George Scott that followed and then David after that, or David and then George Scott. And then Bruiser took it and brought in Buck Robley that nobody liked and Fritz didn't like. And then Ken worked that deal out to merge his Wild West Wrestling, where he came back after the Watts deal fell apart, and he started that little local deal at the Northside Coliseum in Fort Worth, Wild West Wrestling.
Okay.
They merged that, and Ken came back as the booker again and had a stake in the ownership with Fritz. And then that fell apart, and Gary came back a second time. But that was pretty late in the deal, and Gary was able to bring it back to a certain extent. But, you know, as I sit here and say, I may have this out of order because Ken was there when Fritz and Kerry did the deal with Jarrett. So Gary had come back maybe after the Bruiser deal, and then Ken came in. That's what it was. And Ken and Gary were together. And that was bad blood, because I mentioned the proselyting years before.
Yeah.
There had been bad blood, and that's where allegedly Ken Mantell, and this was not a gimmick, this was a work, paid the missing link to attack Gary in the booking office there at the Sportatorium. And it was witnessed by others, and Gary pulled his razor blade out and went to work on the Link's face, and he ran out fearing for his life.
Wow.
So I've got it right now here this second time. So Ken and Gary were not bed partners at all, and that got ugly, and Gary wound up leaving again, and then the deal was done where Fritz wanted out. Kerry tried to save it. They did the deal with Jarrett. Mantell then was out. Fritz was out. Jarrett came in and ran it for the last 2.5 years.
Wow. That's remarkable.
Well, when you think from 82 through 87, it was a revolving door of bookers.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, Ken Mantell won that $10,000 on a pole match the night of Star Wars after the Von Erich Flair match. And I think I said to Paul, I said, well, yeah, just go back to booking matches, and, you know, maybe he took that $10,000, and maybe that's why Gary Hart was a little upset as well. So.
Yeah. Ken's a great guy, great mind for the business. I liked Ken.
He just hired someone to go to town.
Yeah.
That's insane, by the way. Yeah. That is insane. That happens in the mafia. That's wild. I'm glad Gary survived that.
Yeah, Gary has talked about that on some of his later podcasts.
I think it's in his book as well.
Yeah.
That's, by the way, if you have not read his autobiography, it's hard to come by the hard copy, but you can get a Kindle version or something.
Yeah, and you can watch it online and just listen to it.
Oh, yeah, the narration.
Yeah, but the Link and Ken Mantell had been pretty well associated for years.
Wow, that's amazing.
The Link and his wife lived in a nudist colony.
Of course they did. Really?
And it was fairly near a rest stop on a road, because the Link used to like to make appearances at certain times.
I'm sure he wore his makeup while he was naked as well.
But Gary had no use for the Link, for Ken Mantell, or anybody that was associated, because Gary...
I don't blame him.
As brilliant as Gary was, Gary realized that there's a cutthroat nature in wrestling, just like in broadcasting, and he always watched his back and was very careful.
Look at you bringing that full circle to the cutthroat industry of the Major League Baseball.
Well, the church is that way. I experienced that in ministry.
That is crazy, though, and I think about too. I loved the Missing Link as a kid, but that's a whole other story. And now picturing him in his Nature Boy outfit, as I love that, by the way, when Michael Hayes was a face talking about the lead-in to said match that we talked about, he said, what is a Nature Boy anyways? Some guy walking around in the forest naked, and Bill's like, that sounds about right. So
well, speaking of Nature Boy, let's not wrap this up without giving proper adieu to Ric Flair.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
It is easy to understand why he was the NWA heavyweight champion.
Yes.
The world champion. the way he presented the business, the way he presented himself. He had a great body for his day.
Right.
That gorgeous hair.
I love that hair.
The intensity on the interviews. He could come across as a somewhat classy, aloof, patronizing personality at times. And in the ring, he was so good.
So good. And I commented to Paul how exhausted he looked at times in certain interviews, because this guy is doing, Broadway matches. He's doing the press. He's doing the interviews. He's having to go from one city to another, but he's doing it. And like a rock star, he's a true rock star of the ring. Yeah, I know we're starting to run a little low on time, and there are some questions from fans, which I want to get to as well. And I want to kind of pay a proper tribute to Bill at the end, if there's anything that we left out that we want to wrap up. Do you mind if I ask you some questions from fans?
You do that, and while you look at him, I'm going to make a parallel what you just said about Flair and his exhaustion. That played in with young David Von Erich as well, because during what we're talking about, David was absent because he went to Florida to get experience as a heel down there, and then was back and forth, then in the middle of all of this, and then has the Japan deal. Part of why David may have cut some corners on decisions was because he's mentally and physically exhausted.
Right.
And then the tragedy was what we know it was.
Yeah, it is a brutal business besides the mafioso aspect that you described with Missing Link. But at the end of the day, the storytelling that we talked about in that 82 series culminate almost a year, with Gary Hart. And I love that Gary Hart had this, he later on with Flair and the NWA, they had a whole deal, basically similar storyline with the Great Muta and a little bit of a bounty going on there. And Terry Funk coming into the fold and whatnot, just so good. And Gary Hart is one of those guys, goes down in history. I love that he was low key. I love that he was under the radar and subtle. I think we need more of that. I don't think there's enough of that.
And Gary would state that in his defense.
Of course he would. I'm sure he would. Okay, so just a couple questions, 3 actually. One is from Sylvia. She's a friend of the show. She's all the way in Germany. Have you, Mark, ever wanted to get more involved in wrestling in the aspect of like on camera becoming a manager? Did you ever have the desire to be a manager for talent?
No, I never did. I enjoyed the broadcasting. And of course I declared for the ordained ministry in 87 and had known that was in my future even years before. So I quit pursuing other broadcast opportunities after about 84.
Okay.
But my future was going that way, so I never had any aspirations. Now, I love to be a heel nowadays, and if Paul were with us, I'd sick one of you on each other and gas the fire or sick me on them, because that's just fun. But I do that with my in-laws and friends.
I don't think I could ever be a true heel, but maybe I could. I don't know. I could dig a little deeper. Okay, Zufa Raponi asks, what was the vibe in the company after Chris Adams got arrested on the flight home from Puerto Rico?
Pretty down.
Yeah.
Because we had already had so many episodes of tragedy. And now we have this behavioral issue, which had made the headlines, and there's no more dangerous place to get yourself in trouble than in the skies, because that is so carefully policed and the consequences are so severe, and the publicity so over the top. That was a horrible situation. And Chris made a horrible decision, but it's from alcohol abuse. And as I shared, I think on our first segment, Chris was never one of my favorites because you never knew which Chris Adams you were going to get.
Right.
And he would come out and go after me some nights. And, we're here to have heat with the Von Erichs or with Gino, whomever it is you're with. You're not going to make any money and get mad at me. He just had that angry chip on his shoulder deal that alcohol brought out. And that was a killer and a big embarrassment, and there was no way to cover it.
It's a shame. It's a shame. Anthony Mark has quite a few statements. He's a big fan of yours, but he brought up Jake the Snake. And we have a show on Patreon called Legends of the Territories, where we kind of dig a little bit deeper on particular wrestlers. And we did a whole segment on Jake being in world class, and specifically his vignettes he did with Bill in like a junkyard, not a junkyard, but like a dilapidated area of Texas. What are your thoughts on Jake the Snake when he was in world class?
Well, he was great talent, and his gimmick was over the top. He was a big name that brought credibility. Bill Mercer loved those features.
Really?
That was a new dimension. It was a part of that world-class innovative production that he loved doing. And Jake, I never knew him well, but he's the one that verified some information about my pal Gino and his life that led me to the conclusion that I made about Gino's death.
Right. And
Jake was very helpful in that.
Yeah, and circling back to Bill and those vignettes, it was the vignette with Kamala, the debut. I think that was one of his favorites that he brought up in our interview together. And another one involved being at a water park, and I still haven't tracked down who that was.
Well, somebody in the comments
that's right.
on that said that was Bugsy McGraw.
Okay.
And Bugsy's the one that loved the water. And that was an aspect that I was never involved in because those features didn't happen on the show I was doing.
Yeah.
But Bill went down the slide, and then they wanted to do a second take of it so they could get a side angle of him coming down. And Bill got the biggest kick out of that.
That is fantastic. I'm looking, if anybody can help us find that clip of Bill going down the slide, and we want to check that out. Mark had sent me a clip of Bill interviewing the dynamic duo at a nightclub. I was going to post the audio, but it's really not about the audio. It's the video. It's the visuals. It is leading into the hair versus hair match, which, we covered on the show as well. It is hilarious and phenomenal. I'm sure the music we couldn't clear as well. That might be an issue too, but it's fantastic. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. Ryan Povich asked, of these feuds, which one was your favorite? Von Erich's Freebirds, Von Erich's Devastation Incorporated, Freebirds Devastation Incorporated, or Erich Embry and Akbar's Army?
I would have to say Von Erich's versus Freebird.
Yeah.
Because we're talking here about 82 and all the buildup for 2 years prior.
Right.
It goes on another 2 years, although Gary's not involved in his people. The Von Erichs and the Birds have that feud that goes on, and that is long running for a wrestling feud. And by the time we get to May of 84 at Texas Stadium, it's no wonder there's 35,000 people there. Yeah. It has been built and teased and built and teased so long that it was just like we talked about before. It almost had a worship quality about it of goodness finally triumphing over evil in the explosion of Kerry winning.
Yeah.
And Flair handled himself so well with that.
He sure did. What are your thoughts about, I threw in my 2 cents in regards to that match. It is what it is, but my armchair booking, I would have liked to seen that match end with Kerry putting the claw on Flair and pinning him 1, 2, 3 to finish that match. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that would have been a great finish, and I don't know what went into that because that was a Ken Mantell year.
With the backslide, yeah.
And Fritz was very much involved because Fritz was having to negotiate and do PR work with the other promoters to get them to do that for Kerry because they didn't respect Kerry. They didn't like Kerry because of the no-show, the drugs, the out-of-his-mind stuff,
right.
Not too bright, and that's why it was such a brief deal.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Flair had conditions or if the NWA had conditions as to how that would occur. I just don't know. But I did not know that the belt was going to change until right before the match.
Wow.
And since I was doing that, that's the world-class show should have been Bill, and he was out.
Right. We talked about that in the first interview.
I knew it was going to be such an experience for the audience. I needed to know how it was going to go.
Course,
because if these people are going to be hurt and disappointed, I had to be their pastor, so to speak.
Yeah.
And if Kerry's going to win, then I had to be the cheerleader and put it in the perspective that I did. And that's when Ken Mantell said, we're gonna change the belt.
Wow. Man, we could talk all day. And what I love about this is, we will continue to talk all day further down the road. But before we wrap this up, I would like to know if there's anything that we didn't talk about in regards to Bill, anything you want to say, or any final thoughts about our good friend Bill Mercer.
Well, first, I would say I'm very grateful for the opportunity that our paths crossed. We reunited in 2014 on a podcast out of New York that some guys did, and had a great time. And as Bill and I would occasionally get together, Bill developed a respect for me that hadn't been there before, not because there was a problem, just because we never worked that closely. He was apples, I was oranges, so to speak.
Right.
But he paid some compliments to me, which were very meaningful because I knew they were sincere and they came from what he had observed. And I'm very grateful that we had the chance to do the interview with him in August of 2024, to get to him while we still could. And to have him as sharp as he was, and for him to appreciate he and I being together, because we visited about some of the stuff we talked about at the Open.
Yeah.
After the taping was over, and committed to get together again, which we had planned to do. I talked to him in February about a date to get over and do an interview for another individual that we both know. And he was really down. And he said, Mark, I'm getting better. Can we give this a few weeks? Give it 3 or 4 weeks, and then call me, and we'll take a look at April. Well, I was literally getting ready to call him because I got busy with other things and was a couple of weeks late.
Right.
And next thing I know, he's gone.
Yeah.
And evidently, we never would have gotten to do it because he only came back so far, because when you're 99 in pneumonia, and my only regret about Bill is I wish I had been able to help him have a little more community in his last few years, because he was over there by himself. He was in that complex, very nice thing, and would eat, but most of the older people there had very little frame of reference.
Yeah.
And I could tell Bill was lonesome because I'm not sure if he'd lost a son to death. I'm almost certain he had. He had lost his wife. His granddaughter was halfway across the country. There wasn't a lot of community left for Bill.
Yeah.
And I hate that for anybody, and I hate it for someone I loved.
As someone who used to visit elder care facilities when I was a kindergarten teacher, their faces would light up when those kids came in and they played board games with the kids. And I would always tell the kids this. I said, you don't understand. There's some of these folks in this home have not seen anybody for a long time, and it gets really lonely when you're just sitting in a room by yourself. So when you were able to go there, the stars aligned, the powers of the universe, Lord, whatever you want, made it happen. What a special moment we had. You filming it, kind of leading into it, which to this day, it makes me smile knowing that it was a journey that came about because of, the Iron Claw movie. If it wasn't for that film, whether people like it or not, no matter, regardless of how accurate that film was, the fact that I was able to go to that with my co-host Dustin from $2 Late Fee, leading into meeting David Manning, reaching out to you, to your church, and the church saying, well, here's Mark's email address, all these things leading up to Bill reaching out to his granddaughter, Rachel, getting him on the show. It all came to be, and it was a really magical experience. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to be a part of that. You guys obviously have this relationship, this history. It's a beautiful thing. Bill's life is preserved on TV and YouTube and wrestling clips for generations to come. His books that he's written as well. There's so much of his history that's recorded, and thankfully it is. We don't all have that opportunity in life.
Absolutely. And you and I can, I think, share this with our audience and hopefully beyond our audience through word of mouth.
Right.
Bill's an example. Don't ever quit on life. Don't ever get up on life. Every setback is an opportunity for a comeback. And hard work, a positive attitude, uncovering every rock to look for that golden nugget, that man put it back together. And he, like I say, achieved more stardom with wrestling than he ever would have with Major League Baseball.
Right.
And that should be an inspiration to all of us, because life is hard and getting harder. But don't let depression and defeat set in. There's always a day that the sun's going to shine again, and keep the dream alive.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you, Marc. Thank you for doing this, coming on the show, trekking all the way out here from Texas.
It is such a tremendous sacrifice for me to kick back on a train in a private compartment with a libation or three, with no responsibility, a dining car waiting for me. That is such a humble sacrifice I make to have to come out here.
Well, you know, call yourself Jesus. And,
By the way, the train is not for everybody. Talk to me before you go. You have to love the rails.
And I'll tell you this right now, the bullet train in Japan is not what I expected as well. So that's a conversation we'll have offline. But thank you so much, Marc, for doing this.
Absolutely. Blessings to our audience and blessings to you and your family and all your work.
Looking forward to the next time we do this. All right.
I am so nervous that it's really hard for me to even do the commentary in this bout. I can't get over how this Tarrant County Convention Center somehow, like a full moon with wolves or two lovers in the park, brings out the wildest in everybody.